And we're live. Thanks everyone for joining us today. I'm excited to be joined by four very talented authors today to talk about their work. We've got a variety of genres with us, from paranormal to horror to thriller to generally spooky in honor of Halloween. This is, I believe, our 10th Q&A this year, so I just wanted to say thank you to everyone for joining these. We really enjoy doing them. I do want to apologize in advance. I do have my dog with me today, as I was talking to these authors about earlier. So he may be a bit barky. If he wants attention, we may get some dog visits later. So stay tuned. For everyone joining us today, can you comment in the chat where you're calling in from so we can see where everyone is located? And in the meantime, why don't we get started with introductions? Cheryl, why don't you go first?
My name is Cheryl Bradshaw, and I've been publishing since 2011. I write mainly in the genres of mystery, thriller, and supernatural suspense. I have a few different series. The one that we'll probably be talking about today will be my paranormal, like kind of a ghost mystery series, but it still has murder for like the mystery. I kind of wanted to combine both into a series that had supernatural because I like where you can go with supernatural series. So that's been a lot of fun thinking about starting and which series next year we'll see.
Ooh, that sounds interesting. We're all about the supernatural today. Kel, why don't you go next?
I am Kel, and I write paranormal romance and fantasy romance. I dabbled a bit in like upper YA, but I've kind of found my place in more adult romance, I think, after like sort of figuring out my branding and sussing through that. So that's about me.
And Abby, what about you?
I write under A.L. Knorr. I've been writing since the end of 2016, and I write upper, young adult, and new adult, epic and contemporary fantasy. So always my stories have some supernatural elements in them.
What about you, Skyla?
I'm Skyla Dawn Cameron. I have been basically writing since I could hold a pencil, but I've been in publishing for about 20 years now. I write a variety of genres, some urban fantasy and adventure. I have a domestic thriller out, a couple of horror books, a mystery series in progress. Basically, what they all have in common is that they're about women who solve their problems with violence and coarse language.
Sounds like my kind of books.
Like, I need to read those.
So we have a bunch of different people calling in. We have some people from Michigan, some people from Portland, St. Louis. So thanks everyone for joining us. Let's talk a little bit about how you got started in your genre, whether it's paranormal to horror to generally spooky stories with supernatural elements and creatures. Skyla, why don't you start for this one?
I genuinely like being scared, so I lean towards horror because I have a very high threshold, but there's also cats in my books, by the way, you can't tell, yeah. I like to be scared. I wasn't censored growing up with what I was able to watch or read. So I ended up with just a lot of mysteries and a lot of horror. So it's just what I veer towards now.
Cheryl, what about you?
I grew up reading Agatha Christie. So that kind of, my very first series was mystery. And I love writing mystery, but what I don't love about it is sometimes all the research. It's fascinating, but it's time consuming. And so that kind of got me onto the idea of the second thing that I love, which is like ghost stories and any kind of witch, paranormal. And so I thought, I could get away with so much more if I probably wrote in kind of the realm of like the magic where the impossible is possible. And so that's how I ended up starting my paranormal suspense series, and it went over really well. And so it's something that I am looking at coming back to now because of it.
Yeah, that is kind of a good way to get around that research part, to make your own worlds. Abby, what about you?
Yeah, I wanted to write since I was really little. Like, my mom taught me to read when I was about 3. So I was always drawn to stories for as long as I can remember. I was terrible with numbers, but I really loved letters. So I know I've had stories in my head ever since I was little, but growing up, I couldn't figure out how to crack the code on publishing. It just seemed like this is such an intimidating thing. And when I realized that self-publishing was a viable option, which I feel like I was late to the game. I was like, why didn't I figure this out sooner? I had this amazing story. It was a mermaid story that just would not leave me alone. And I had to write this story about this mermaid who's diving, and I love marine biology and I love nautical history, and what a great way to explore shipwrecks and, you know, all the cool stuff that's under the water. And she finds this shipwreck, a very 150-year-old shipwreck, and she, you know, goes around to the front of the ship and she blows away the algae on the figurehead, and she sees her own face on the carving. And that idea just spawned into this story that I just had to write. It took me, you know, a year to write it because it was my first book. But from there, I was like, well, now I've written a water story. I should write a fire story and an earth story. And from there, it spiraled into all these other supernatural elements like ghosts and witches and wraiths and fire magi and, you know, kitsune. Like, I just love supernatural mythology, and I love taking supernatural mythology and putting my own, you know, spin on it. So that's kind of how I got sucked into the vortex.
I love that you found a way to kind of combine all of your interests into one story. That's always, I think, the best way to do it, because you actually enjoy the research and can kind of combine it into your work. Mm-hmm. Kel, how did you get started?
I was not really an early reader. I got into reading late elementary school. Like, I read before that, but I didn't really read for enjoyment. Harry Potter was actually what got me into it. So I really wanted to know what happened next. The movies weren't all out yet. And so my mom said, here you go, slaps down the Chihuahua book, Chihuahua Killer book. And so that's kind of where I got like my first start with reading. That continued for a few years, where I basically just continued to devour anything that was YA paranormal. I wasn't super interested in contemporary at the time, and I think that that's continued, where now I will read it, but when I was younger, definitely not my thing. I ended up writing my first book when I was 14, 15. So I actually talked about this a bit in my readers group recently. So I'm like sussing through the information in my head. I was bullied a lot growing up. And so with that, I kind of turned inward a lot, and that led me toward writing. And I just wrote what I wanted to read and what I wanted to live. And so that ended up looking like Fantasy Academy, whatnot. And that actually was my very first book. I then published not quite a decade later as Daisley Academy. So that's kind of where I got my start.
It's all kind of come full circle. Thank you for sharing that. Everyone here today also writes titles that include romance, including paranormal romance. What is it that you like most about writing romance kind of within these genres? And where do you see the romance subgenre heading over the next few years? It's a bit of a difficult question. Abby, why don't we start with you?
Dang it, I knew you were going to start with me. I wish I could see the future. My romance is always a secondary thread. Like, there's definitely romance in my stories, but no matter how much I try to sit down and write a romance, I can't actually produce what I can call a romance at the end of the story. It's like, this is a an adventure story, or this is a mystery, a ghost story, or this is a fairy tale, or whatever. And the romance is there as well, because it's really important. But I always tend to weave the romance in, starting as a friendship. I haven't done enemies to lovers yet. I'm going to work on that. But they start as friends, and maybe they're a little bit bantery and bickery, and they kind of, they're thrown into this adventure together. And through their challenges that they face, and, conflicts and the clashes that they have, they start to realize that they respect each other and like each other, and it grows from there. As far as where the genre is headed, I have no idea. I don't know.
That's okay. You can skip that one.
Spotting trends. I write whatever I feel like writing, and then I'm like, oh, I guess I should have done Academy 3 years ago. Oops.
It's okay. I feel like writing is more authentic when you kind of go with what you're interested in, what you naturally enjoy writing, versus maybe like what's trending at the moment. But I like what you said about friends to lovers. Banter is the best part of reading a good romance novel. So that's great. So. And we're looking forward to your enemies to lovers once that happens. Cheryl, what about you?
I feel like there's always a romantic element to my books, but I would say the same thing. Like, it's like on the back burner. It's kind of, the guy is always in the story, but my series is always focused on like the female sleuth, or the female, as if she's in my Supernatural series, she starts out by she can see dead people, and then she kind of turns into like realizing she's a descendant from witches, and so it kind of goes from there. And so and the guy is in book 1 very early on, and then their relationship actually grows through the series, which I like, but I always want the story to be more about her perspective, and what the kind of like where she is going in solving, like, these people, these ghosts are appearing because they aren't on the other side, and she's got to figure out like who murdered them, what actually happened. And then the guy is kind of weaved in. And I also like the men I kind of like it to be a really feisty sort of, they don't just meet and like each other. I find that's kind of more fun to write than just, oh, hey, So my female leads are always very, I would say they're more aggressive personality types. And so I like to kind of have them soften as they get to know the man who ends up being the love interest. And as far as where I see it going, like, to me, like, romance is, that category is something that's always people wanting to read. And so I see, and what I like about the genres that we all write in is that you can dabble in different subgenres that aren't straight romance, because I think that would be kind of hard for me to write too. But what I'm finding is that a lot of times a series like that sometimes even has a bit of selling itself, because I don't think it's being overly saturated like some of the other mainstream, like a mainstream romance. And I find that there's a lot of interest right now, especially in all different forms of fantasy. And I see that kind of having like its moment right now, and I'm thinking that it will continue. I hope it does.
Kel, what about you?
Oh man, I knew you were going to call on me as soon as my dog started going off in the background. So if
I'm
you saw me
to feel like an evil teacher or something.
That wasn't at you, Laura. That wasn't at you, Cheryl. It was because I knew it, and then my dog just started going at it outside. So I started off writing not a lot of romance, very slow burn. It's always been pretty angsty, and if it's not enemies to lovers, it's like, at least from one party, it's enemies, even if the other one doesn't see it that way. As I got older and I wrote more books, and my writing style matured, I find that I really enjoy writing romance. So much so that I think that, paranormal romance and fantasy romance are probably where I'm going to stick around for the most part for a bit. There's times that I really want to run off and do something, crazy, like an epic high fantasy with no romance. But I know I know my readers, I know my audience, they would not be very happy with me for that. As for where I see romance going, I think the big thing I would say is that standalones are the name of the game. Readers, like the rest of the world, 2020 happened, and I think our attention spans and everything and our ability to look at long game just kind of shortened. And if you look at the store, you will have seen in the last year that standalones, particularly in paranormal and fantasy romance, where they were not many before, have so many that are doing so well now. So I would say that that's definitely what I see.
Interesting. That's a good point about since 2020, we do all have much shorter attention spans. Skyla, what about you?
So I don't actually really write romance either. There are romantic elements in some of my books, but I don't tend to write happily ever afters, and so I don't really claim that genre. But at the same time, actually, I think romance and horror are kind of two sides of the same coin, if you think about it, because they're both genres where you can explore the feelings and prioritize the feelings of marginalized people. Romance is really well known for that, in that people of color, white women, LGBTQ people, they all get their desires validated and prioritized in the story. Horror also fulfills sort of a similar thing, because I mean, how many horror stories are there about the woman who knows something isn't right here, something very bad is happening here, and it turns out she's right. You know, there is a killer, there is a xenomorph. So in a lot of ways they are similar. They offer catharsis, validation, and I think the things that attract people to romance also attract them to horror. As for where romance is going, I don't really have an opinion on that, although I do agree standalones in general are probably going to be very popular, again, because of that difficulty with a long-running series, which is unfortunate because I tend to veer towards long-running series.
I think there'll always be a soft spot for series with readers as well. That's a good point about horror and romance kind of making us, we're both kind of drawn to them. I think that they both make readers feel like heightened emotions. So that's definitely makes sense to me. Let's skip to talking about marketing a little bit. How do you market your titles? Because Cheryl, for example, you have multiple mystery series on the go. How do you market each series specifically?
I tend to always try to focus on the first book in that series instead of like trying to, I'll market like the new book coming out in the series too, but I always like to go back to book one because I think that's an easier thing to focus on is if I'm trying to market and I have so much money that I'm going to market with, I'd rather put, it's kind of like being in Vegas and betting it all on one, you know. I find I'm always trying to find, with marketing in mind, new readers who haven't read my books before. So by starting with book one and pushing that, I find that it's like a trickle down effect of them reading it and then naturally progressing to the other books in the series. And that's always worked pretty well for me.
When you say focusing on book one, are you discounting book one? Are you doing like a perma-free? What has really worked for you?
I'm always trying to be in sales and run ads and discount books. But when I am specifically advertising to a book one, I keep that at full price. Generally, unless it's in a special sale or whatever. I also really like to discount like the middle child book, you know, the book in the middle, because especially with people that haven't read you before, if you're like, number 3 is free, and they're like, but I want 1 and 2, I want to read 1 and 2 also, but then now I've read 3, I've got to read 4. So I love discounting the middle book, and I do that a lot in my series. I find it sells the other books both ways.
Interesting. And yeah, maybe that's a good point for someone who has read the first two, forgotten, and now has the opportunity to come back and read your middle child. So that's a good idea. Skyla, you have both standalones and series mysteries and paranormal titles in your backlist. Do you market your series differently than maybe your standalones?
I don't know. I kind of feel like the worst person to ask about marketing because I really don't. I love Kobo promotions. I recommend those to absolutely everybody. The most effective thing I've done, honestly, was, I'm just going to pull it out here. So on social media, I did a very simple promo with this book cover, horror, right? And the text beside it said, "Yes, it's scary, but nothing bad happens to the cats."
That's awesome.
Because if you love horror, you know someone's always killing the pet. Someone kills the family dog, someone kills the cat. And a lot of horror readers, honestly, we want to be scared, but we don't want to worry about the cats and dogs, right? And that promo was shared by people well outside my circle and turned out to be very effective marketing. They didn't care what the book was about. They knew that the cats would be okay and it was scary. So that's probably my most effective promotional tactic.
Sometimes it's just like the simplest type of promotion. Sometimes I think we're overthinking marketing and maybe we should just go back to simple things like that. Abby, like you mentioned, you write kind of like your mermaid series. You have some urban fantasy, you have some high fantasy. Do you find you have a lot of crossover readers, or are they kind of in separate groups?
No, I do have a ton of crossover readers. I was actually kind of shocked at how many came with me when I crossed over into epic fantasy. I'm still a little bit shocked about that. And I recently asked them if A.L. Knorr had to stick with one genre, contemporary / urban or epic, which would it be? And the majority of them said epic. And I was like, what? Okay. I love writing both, so I don't have a problem with that. But I really love Kelly, your comment about standalones, because I'm going to try that, a series of standalones, basically. So you can just read one of them if you want, and you won't miss anything else. But I really like that idea because then you have the option of both. You can read a standalone, and if that universe really sucks you in and you like some of the other characters, then you can continue on. But if you're just wanting some to dip in and dip out again, that's there's no downside. And I find, so this is going to sound so cliche, but the best marketing I've ever done is gone back and polish books that I'd written early on that I knew were good, but they weren't good enough. They were just as good as I could produce at the time. So I went back. Oh my gosh, it's such a difficult thing for an author to go back. Like, you just want to focus on your new baby. But I went back and I polished and polished and polished, and I, fixed errors, and I, made it gleam as much as I could with the time that I had, and I put it back out there. And I definitely saw good results from doing that. And so I took a lesson from that. And now I'm so nitpicky when I'm editing, and I'm really careful when I'm formatting. And I, experimented with this epic fantasy to get a professional formatter to work on it and make the inside really gorgeous. Oh my gosh, it takes so much work, as you guys always know, but readers really love that. And now I don't have to touch it because I've put so much effort into it that it's really nice. I can just, push it now. And whereas I look back at other series, I'm like, man, I should really pay attention to that. The experience of that particular series I haven't touched in 5 years. I could definitely make it better, because new readers are always coming in through the series, and they tend to go, my most visited website page is reading order. They go to that page and like, where do I start? Because, things are all intermingled. And so I know that people are going back and starting at that very first book that I ever wrote, which 6 years ago, I wasn't the writer that I am now. So, going back and, trying to improve the experience for readers has been a great, it's not really specifically a marketing tactic, but it's definitely something that's helped. And then beyond that, there's, aside from Kickstarter, because I'm terrified to try it, I've done everything, Facebook ads and all the in-house promos I can get my hands on, and book funnel and cross promotions with other, comparable authors. I've done everything. And what's fun is that I love how I just use the word fun. Everything changes. Like, what worked 6 months ago doesn't work anymore. So you're constantly trying something new, constantly trying to get your books in front of new readers. But what I love about what Skyla said is, like, when you find a really powerful hook, man, can you ever leverage that? Oh, okay, you guys are still there. I just love that, like that tagline. I've had a few too that just grabbed people and they worked. Like I created an ad and went back to check on it. I'm like, what? These numbers are crazy. Why is this ad doing so well? And it's usually to do with the hook. Is the hook really good? Those are so hard to do, but when you can get them, they just leverage all of your efforts that much more.
Yeah, a good hook is so powerful. And I like what you were saying about going back to look at your first book and where you started. That's one of the good things about being indie, is that you have the opportunity to go back whenever you'd like and update a cover, refresh the content, add bonus content, that kind of thing. So definitely something that authors should take advantage of. Kel, many of your books are co-written with author Aurelia Jane. How do you work with Aurelia to market your titles as a writer duo?
Well, it's good you mentioned her, because that was actually bringing up marketing was going to be a big thing. So as many authors know, indie or trad, but especially indie, marketing can be a full-time job by itself if you get into it. There's Facebook ads, there's TikTok, there's this, there's that. And it seems like every year there's a new platform popping up. Every 6 months, things change. And there's always new ways to reach readers. So me and Aurelia work really well because I actually have a really good head for marketing. And it helps I can focus on that for longer periods of time when needed, while helping and plotting with Aurelia, so that she can get more of the writing done in that time frame. And then we kind of meet in the middle and sort of swap off, going back and forth with it. So it works really well having a partner that you've got a good relationship with, that you're able to do that with, because I know that I tend to feel really bad if I don't get words in. It'll be something for me that, like, if I don't get my chapter in for the day or whatever, like, it would make me feel really bad, even if I got like 100 other things done. But knowing that, she at least got her chapter in and I got 99 of the 100 other things done. So I'm good enough then. So I would definitely say having a writing partner when you guys work well and have really good communication can definitely benefit marketing for sure.
That's a great point. And now I wanted to talk a little bit, since we have so many authors with years of publishing behind them on the call. What's your best words of advice for authors writing in your genres who are looking to kind of improve their reach and expand their readership? Maybe Cheryl, we'll start with you for this one.
I was like, oh, I never know who you're going to call, and so I'm like, what would I say?
I was starting to feel like a teacher or something, catching you guys in math class.
During COVID, I kind of got into a mindset of going back to basics, and I did similar to Abby. I went back to my very first book, because everybody wants to read the first book I ever wrote, which is never going to be the best book I've ever written. So I actually went back and I rewrote that as well. But in terms of marketing, I started thinking about what I did when I was first writing to get a fan base in the first place, and how I wasn't really doing a lot of those things anymore. And so during that time period, I created an ad where I did put like the first book in the series free, or I wrote a prequel, and then I gave that away for free, and then in exchange for them signing up to be on my newsletter. And some people, they just want the free book, but then I brought in a whole bunch of other new people. And so for me, when you're first starting out, I think the most important thing is, when somebody hasn't read you, they're going to be willing to take a chance on you if there's no like money involved. So they're like, well, if they don't know if they're going to like your, how you write, your writing style, your books or whatever, I found that the easiest way, until I had a certain size audience was to give them something free. And so in exchange for that, I'd created the ad on Facebook. And so they got the book, but they also became on my newsletter, and they could, decide they didn't want to be or whatever. My main focus was finding new readers during that time. And that's something I think that had fallen by the wayside for me for a while. I just wasn't something that I thought about, because I wasn't doing it anymore. And I thought, well, I think, let's go back to the basics and do what worked for me to get readers in the first place. And that was giving them something at no cost to them so they can take a chance on me.
Back to the basics is a good way of putting it, because like you guys said, there's so many different ways to market your books now. It can be very overwhelming. So it's good to just get back to the basics and focus on that. Skyla, what about you? What advice would you give?
I think my advice is always that there is no exact science. So listen to what works for other people, and remember, you can't always replicate it. So what works for Cheryl won't necessarily work for me. What works for me may not work for Abby. We could have the very similar books, release them, follow similar tactics. One might do extremely well, the other might not. And no one can tell you why. So it's a little frustrating, certainly, never boring. Otherwise, I would say try to sell widely. I think we're going to probably end up talking about that later. That's really important, to not ignore international audiences. Put effort into having a professional book, participate in promotional opportunities when they come up, but always have the caveat that you could do everything right and it may not work. And you could make 100 mistakes and you might sell 1 million copies. We have absolutely no idea. So good luck.
That's a great point. Abby, what about you?
Well, if I were just starting out, I somehow came up with a strategy that worked really well for me at the time. So I took the time to write 2.5 books and finish them fully before I launched anything. So behind the scenes, because I was just learning how to write a story. I didn't really know how to do it. It's very intimidating the first few times. And B, because I was kind of thinking, like dreaming up my launch strategy, because I really only had one crack at it, because I had quit my corporate job and I was like all in with this. I was living in Italy. I had no option to go get a job. If I had gone back to Canada, I knew that I wouldn't have had the guts to really stick it out without having, an income coming in. So my strategy was to write a 6-book series over the course of the first 2 years and make the first 5 books standalones. And instead of, as you know, when you're writing a series, you create a hook at the end to compel the reader into the next book. At least you're hoping for that. Instead of, I couldn't do that with this because they were standalones, and they actually all happened simultaneously. They happened to each character. Each character knew most of the other characters, and their experience happened over the same summer. So it was like a group of kids. They all went somewhere different for the summer. They all had this crazy experience. So I linked them together through text messages. So while you're going on this adventure with one person, you're getting a sense that there's something crazy happening with the other characters, but you're not quite sure what. So I hope to pique their curiosity with that. And it worked. So, and similar to Cheryl giving away some free books, I did that as well. And it worked very well for me. I put one book up for sale and I put the second book up as a giveaway. And I gave away 2,000 copies in exchange for email addresses. And then when I published that second book, I emailed those 2,000 people about the first book, which was already out. And then from there, it just kind of, snowballed. And over the course of that first year, I had 5 books, which I could market as a book 1, as an entrance into the series. So because I typically do, when I write linear series, as you were talking, Cheryl, you focus on book 1. I always do that with linear series too, because you have to start at the beginning. But with this series, you could enter it at any point in those 5 books. And then the 6th book had to be, because it was an ensemble story, it had to be read at the end. So over the course of that first year, I focused on those 5 books every other month. I did a promotion on those, and it always, every time, increased the readership. My goal in my very first year was to basically cover my lost income from my corporate job. And I managed to do that by the skin of my teeth. So that was just one tactic or strategy that, someone could consider using if you want to go look at nuts and bolts ideas.
We have an audience question here. And this can kind of be for everyone. How do you send books for free? I assume you're talking about a digital copy.
Book Funnel.
Yeah.
Anybody who is not on Book Funnel, get on Book Funnel.
Yeah.
Because they're just constantly coming up with new things for us to do that we can, as far as giving books away too. That's just a really simple way that's worked for me.
Yeah, same here.
I agree with Book Funnel. I think that they make it really user-friendly for everyone, and they have great customer service for any of your readers who may be having trouble getting your book, which is nice as well. Kel, what about your advice for people who are starting out?
Don't overcommit yourself. Don't jump in and do too many things. Don't decide that you're going to do TikTok and Facebook and Instagram and Twitter. Okay. Pick your platform that you actually work with, that you enjoy to some capacity. It doesn't have to be a lot, but something, and stick with it. And work on building that platform before you branch out. And giving 20% to 5 different things is not going to yield the same results as 100% to one thing. So that's the big thing that I would tell any author starting out.
That's really good advice.
It's something that I still have to remind myself. So that's why I would give.
Yeah. We're also saying it's really good advice because we've done the opposite and we know.
Yes, it's like, I've done the opposite. Don't do the opposite.
Yeah, there's a lot of pressure for you all as indies to kind of jump on the next big thing, and you are the only person doing everything. So it can definitely eat up a lot of time and create a lot of pressure. I wanted to talk to you all about world building. How do you build up your worlds and figure out maybe the different rules of magic systems, how your supernatural creatures work, that kind of thing? Skyla, let's start with you for this one.
For me, world building is all based on character. It's what's going to serve the character, because I'm a very character-focused writer. So once I have my main characters, it's not even solely world building in supernatural elements, just contemporary books also require world building. You know, what you're paying attention to in the world, what is important in day-to-day life. If you're writing mysteries in terms of laws and what you focus on, all of that has to be in service to the character for me as a writer. So I basically, I let character dictate what I have in my world, what's going to serve them, what's going to serve their journey.
That's a good way of looking at it. Abby, what about you?
World building is interesting. I love it as an activity, but I find it happens kind of organically when I focus on the story. As I was writing my first book, which was a mermaid story, I had the idea for the story and the characters first, and then as the story kind of unfolded and there was more detail developed, I had to answer questions like, you know, what is the life cycle of a mermaid? How does fresh water affect them versus salt water? What abilities do they have? Do they have the voice, you know, that you see in some mythology? And then from there, like it spirals into answering a lot of questions. And often when I find I get stuck, I just have to write down questions I haven't answered yet and then start thinking about those and writing down ideas. And I get unstuck very quickly. And it just kind of becomes this, you know, huge thing that is now almost never ending. So it sort of happens organically at the same time as I'm writing a story. And then once the story is written and the series is yet to come, then I end up, you know, focusing on it and fleshing it out and asking more specific questions.
Cheryl, what about you?
When I first started writing, because I have OCD, I thought, well, I'm going to write it all out like in a notebook, and then I'm going to write it all out on, you know, type it all out. And when I tried to type the story to kind of build on the characters that I had created in their world, it did not work, which is very anti my personality type. So what did work was me creating the the basis of the main character, and because I'm the same, character driven, and letting her go wherever she needs to go and become who she wants to become. So in my Addison Lockhart, the supernatural suspense, she was only ever going to be kind of like a psychic medium, someone that can see spirits and stuff like that. That is all I ever had planned for her. And I thought she'll solve murders along the way, and that'll be great because I know how to write that. But then as I kept creating her world and layering in things, I thought, wouldn't it be cool if she had like witch ancestors, and then she can see the dead, but she also is this. And so that sent her on like a different journey. And for me, that's a fun part of writing, is just, it's actually taking myself away from myself, if that makes sense, because I'm totally, it would be normally out of my comfort zone to have a character just do whatever they want and I just go with it. But it's very freeing for me to write that way. And so that's how I create all of my worlds. I just let them kind of unfold as they want them to. It just kind of comes to me as I'm writing.
So interesting to hear about everyone's different process. Kel, what about you?
Unfortunately, the best I can tell you is insert what everyone else has already said. You have a lot of very character-driven writers on this panel. Yeah, I usually have a basic idea. Like one of my more recent series, I wanted to write about a demon summoning, and the girl and the guy, like the guy was the demon and the girl was in the summoning. And then I was like, okay, we go from there. That was literally the starting point. And then it's like, I'm going to be working on the 7th book in that world. So it's the first time I've actually written like 4 books for the main character. The best friend that wasn't planned, wasn't plotted, wasn't anything, and popped up in the first book now has a trilogy. And it's just, it goes from there. Your characters come across things and they really do take on lives of their own beyond what I think we think as writers that they will or should be.
I love that. That they've kind of taken over. The characters are taking over. Let's talk about the scary and spooky elements a little bit. And if you don't necessarily have scary aspects to your titles, how do you build up and maintain kind of the tension in your plots between characters? Cheryl, let's start with you.
I feel like, and when you write, there's always like aspects of your writing that you know that you're good at, and there's other things that you're like, I'll probably never be excellent at that. But one thing that I have learned that I can do that kind of builds up the tension is I like to make the last line in every chapter like as strong as it can be, so that the reader that was going to go to bed, I don't want them to go to bed. I want them to keep going until they finish the book. I'm trying to just keep them hooked into the story. And so I build up and bring down, like as far as temperature wise, I do that. I tend to do that at the end of chapters to kind of like keeps excitement going. And then I'll start the next chapter like, oh, take a breath. And so and that's what I think writing is. It's a whole series of like, turn it up, turn the heat up, turn it down, turn it up, turn it down. So that just what works for me and what I do in my books.
Skyla, what about you?
Well, tension at its core is basically an unanswered question that the reader wants the answer to, right? For elements of horror, I think that horror is about fear. Fear is about insecurity, anxiety, the unknown. And it's going to vary a lot between different readers. What scares me won't scare you, and so on, because we all have different fears. So I also feel that tension and fear loses a little bit when you give too many answers. That's why something like, David Lynch works extremely well, because he withholds so much of the magic trick that you're left very unsettled. So the example I give people about horror and fear is, imagine you're walking down a dark hallway. and it's very quiet, low lights. You get to the end, there's a door, you open it, and that room is pitch black. That moment where you're standing in the threshold, that is where you're going to have the most fear, because anything can be in that darkness. What scares me can be in there, what scares you can be in there. And when you turn on the light and you show everything that's in there, you're going to lose some of your readers, you're going to lose some of that fear. So horror writers have kind of a very fine balance between showing enough, answering enough questions, but still leaving that tension there and leaving the room still kind of dark rather than fully lit.
Wow, that's a great example. Abby, what about you?
I would say there's two parts to this for me. One is I employ setting a lot. Like setting is really important to me. I'm very visual in my mind, and what I see in my head is what I write down on the page. And the scariest or spookiest series, because I don't set out to write scary stories, but I do have a scary story. The first book is called Bones of the Witch, and she's terrifying. She terrified even me while I was writing her. And the setting is like a small town in Scotland in the winter, and there's graveyards and there's castles and there's old houses and there's old wells and there's an old medieval town underneath there, and there were witch burnings in that place, and there's, old crazy maps, and there's like lots of cool tropes that really attracted me. That while I was writing them, I wasn't thinking, let's make this really spooky. It just kind of came out that way because that was what was attracting me with the story. And then hooking on to what Cheryl was saying about finishing each scene or each chapter with a really strong hook into the next one to keep people reading. I had taken a screenwriting course once that gave me a really valuable little kind of trick, I guess, where you as a writer, you're looking at each scene and you assign a charge to the beginning of the chapter and to the end of the chapter. It has to be a positive charge or a negative charge. And the ending of the chapter and moving into the beginning of the next chapter, that charge has to change. So if the end of that chapter was negative, the next chapter can be positive or it can be extra negative. Like it has to be a change, either a drop or a rise. You can't go too far in one direction, because if you have 3 chapters where it gets bad and then really bad and then really bad, if you go too far without going back up again, there's almost too much tension and you lose your reader. Like they'll give you a reaction that you don't actually want. You want them to be scared and they'll laugh. So just paying attention to that energy as it moves through the story and really, pulling the reader through with your changes in energy. And I just love what you said, Cheryl, about like that strongest finish to a chapter possible. I think that's really important too.
Took me a few tries to unmute there. Yeah, that's a great point. Kind of finding the balance throughout the story. You don't want to overwhelm readers with everything all at once, but you don't want to bore them either. So kind of trying to find your balance there. Kel, what about you?
I would say I don't really write spooky either or scary. For me, a lot of tension actually tends to come from either romance or I don't really write mystery, but I guess there's a little bit of a mystery element in a lot of them. It's the unknown. It's like Skyla was saying, like if you don't know that moment of when the room is dark, and that's just such a great analogy. I want to say that too. Like that was literally perfect. I think that as she had also mentioned with horror and romance, like there's an overlap there. And it's the unknown that's like the sweet spot. But then in the same way that Abby was saying, you don't want to go too far in one direction or the other, and that can look a lot like a relationship progressing too quickly or too slowly, giving away too much or too little. And then the way Cheryl was saying with ending on a hook, that's also something that I focus on, is how to end chapters strong with. When you read a book, typically when you finish a chapter, where it ends is something that you as the reader, like it's unexpected, but it's also what you expect. If you're sitting there flipping the page, like I'm not sure if this was supposed to end here, it might have not ended the right way necessarily, unless you're just flipping the page and it's the end of the book and you're like, what the hell? That might be intentional, but otherwise. I think that we do have certain expectations as readers, and I think that we also carry those over as writers personally. So
lots of great points there. Thanks, everyone. I'm going to share another audience question. Let's wait for it to pop up. Scarlett says, after so many books now, do you ever get to a point where you start a book that just won't work, or do you just hammer at it until it does? And this is free for all if anyone wants to jump in.
The second one. I hammer it. I've had to tear apart a story and had the chapters spread out all over the floor around me. I got in so much trouble and super tangled up in the plot. This is the third book that I wrote. It was such a mess. I could have easily thrown it out and just started over, but I couldn't give up on the idea because there's always a thread in your ideas. You just get attached to them and you're like, this has to have a solution. And it really taught me a lesson that just when you think the knot is untangleable, if you work just that little longer on it, or you take a break and then you come back to it, ideas are there. Like it can be fixed. In my opinion, there's nothing that's not fixable.
I double back. I go and loosen the knot, and it's like if there's no knot because I untied it all, therefore I can only go up from there. I actually have a book right now that's the case. Me and Aurelia got 30,000 words in, and we're like, something's wrong. I'm not quite sure what, but something is wrong. And we started over. We replotted, started over. So that is where we're the opposite there, Abby, in that one. I would love to continue beating it, but I reach a point where I'm like, look, I don't think there's anything of this horse left. I just got to go find another horse.
Well, I think I've written a lot of books. In the past 20 years, I've written about, I lost count, it's probably about 62 or 63 now. Wow. And some books, absolutely, you just have to, go back or keep hitting it, or there's some way, but every single one of those books to write has been completely different. The process has been entirely different. And I had one book I actually just finally released this year. I spent a good 4 years picking at that first draft. It was not working. No matter what I did, I kept going back and retooling it. And I ended up completely changing the tense and point of view to finally get the book to click. And once I did write it, I'm currently writing the 7th. Like, it just suddenly flowed through me. So going back, if you are completely stuck, sometimes you do have to set it aside and go work on something else and then come back to it later. That I like to call it making the books jealous. If you're working on a couple of things, sometimes it has to go in the corner, make it jealous, work on something else. And other times you're just not quite in the place to write that book. And you don't know until you just write a lot and just keep trying.
And we touched on this a little bit, but why is publishing wide important to you? Kel, maybe we'll start with you for this one.
Oh man, caught me off guard there. I would say for me, it's the whole eggs in a basket. If you put all of your eggs in one basket, which the elephant in the room is that basket is KU, someone can take your basket and then you have no eggs. Someone can kick your basket, someone can step on it. Like, there's all kinds of things that can happen to the eggs in the KU basket. And it's not a very safe basket. Whereas if you've got them in lots of different baskets, they might be able to take one, but it's hard to take them all. So that's kind of my mentality with wide. I'm also a big believer in how do you sell the same book again and again and again. And that applies to wide, not just in this language, but other languages. That applies to audio and special editions. How do I get the same book to sell to as many people as possible that it's going to sell to, essentially? And wide just really fits that mindset that my business is focused on.
Some great points. And I love the basket metaphor, kicking the basket, stealing the basket. That was great.
Metaphors are my thing. So.
Cheryl, what about you?
I find that I want to be where my customer is, and not every single customer is going to be on one platform. And I don't ever want, I never want my readers to think like, well, if I want to read her books, then I have to go here. This is the only option, because I want them to know that I want to be, where do you want me to be? Where do you need me to be? That's where I'm going to go. And I just find that even if you have a smaller audience in one place than the other place, it's not a big deal to just put yourself as in as many places as you can be to reach as many people as you can reach. That's what's always been important to me, and also listening to what they tell me. Like I actually ask every few years. I'll say, "What's everybody reading on now?" Or are you ebook still? Are you paperback? What? And I noticed I don't know if it's something happened during COVID, and mainly for mystery I can speak to anyway. But I found that a lot of people were buying more of my paperbacks, more than I've ever sold before. So then that's a matter of like, okay, and I've got people asking me for large prints. So it's just really like, what do they want from me, and how can I make sure that my books are seen in as many places as possible.
That's a great point. Abby, what about you?
Yeah, I would have to echo both those ladies. I think the basket analogy is genius. It's perfect. And for me, I think when you are a creator and you have created something, and this is speaking as somebody who was exclusive and is in transition to going wide, I really dislike not being able to put that creative work wherever I want to put it, in front of whoever and who was interested in it. And those people, those readers are everywhere. They're all over the place. They're listening to audiobooks. They're reading large print, as you're saying. They're reading comics. They're listening to books on YouTube. Like, they're everywhere. And so, there's so much effort and blood, sweat, and tears that goes into the creation of these stories. It just seems like, yes, I understand the appeal of being exclusive for a short period of time, especially if you're, still learning the ropes and you don't want to be overwhelmed by all these, platforms that you could learn. But ultimately, wide has always been that's where I'm headed. That's where I'm going, because my books need to be everywhere for whoever wants to read them in whatever format they want.
That's a great way of putting it. And like Cheryl said, it's also good to kind of check in with your readers and see where they're reading, because there might be somewhere that your books aren't that you can send them to. Skyla, what about you?
I have always sold wide. I've always felt very, very strongly about it. Again, agree completely with the basket metaphor there. Yes, some people do extremely well putting all of their eggs in that basket, and I'm extremely happy for them. But in addition to writing, I also freelance as an editor and a designer. So I talk with a lot of writers who are just starting out, and a lot of them are chasing that big KU, primarily American audience, and struggling. And I always say, don't ignore your international audience. They have different buying habits than KU buyers do. You may find I have some series that do extremely well in Kobo Plus in the Netherlands. I have other books that sell extremely well in Australia. And all of these different readers have completely different buying habits. They shop at different places. They like different price points. And if something's not working, then explore all of these many, many fantastic options. And I completely agree. I want my books available to a lot of people. I shop on different stores. I look at my buying habits and consider other people do that as well.
Lots of great points there from everyone, for sure. So we're getting close to time here. So I wanted to wrap up by asking all of you what you have coming up next and where everyone can find you online. Abby, do you want to start?
Sure. I am currently working on a contemporary fantasy series called Pretty Little Mermaids, which is a spin-off of the other mermaid stories that I've created. And behind the scenes working on a standalone epic fantasy series that is a spin-off of the Scented Court, which just completed this year. And readers can find me, mainly my website is the best place to go, because from there you can branch out to wherever you like. And it's www.alknorrbooks.com.
Perfect. That sounds great, the spin-off series. I love the name Pretty Little Mermaids too. It's a good one. Cheryl, what about you? What do you have coming up next?
I am on book 8, just finishing book 8 of my Georgiana Germain mystery series, and I am also plotting a witch series. It's taking a long time, but it's just not where it needs to be for me to start it, feel confident starting it yet, but it's getting there. And I would say the same thing Abby said. From my website, you can find all of my links to everywhere, and that's CherylBradshaw.com.
Perfect. Skyla, where can people find you and what are you working on?
My website, SkylaDawnCameron.com. I'm also on Blue Sky at the moment, and Patreon I'm pretty active at. At the moment, actually in a week and a half, I have the second book in a contemporary mystery series coming out. Actually, I'm very pleased with these. If you don't mind me showing off my...
Sure. Show us.
The hardcover editions are special and have like the old school Nancy Drew look.
That's so cool.
Really nice.
Wow.
So I'm excited about that. This was the book that took me 4 years to finally crack. So I currently have that. The first one's out. The second one is out soon. The third one is out in April.
Very exciting. Yeah, I love the old school Nancy Drew look for sure. Kel, what about you? What's up next?
I am currently working on my standalone for season 3 of Immortal Vices and Virtues. So it's a shared world that I run. And as I mentioned, it's season 3. So me and AJ are working on that. And we're also working on a fantasy romance series that will be standalones connected in the same way Abby was talking about. So you can find me by going to my website at kelcarpenter.com, but I will be fully upfront. If you actually want me to engage, you're more likely to find me in my Facebook group or on my Patreon. While I have a lot of platforms, I am working on taking my own advice on focusing on the ones that I'm actually on. So
We appreciate the honesty. That's great to hear. Thanks everyone for tuning in, and thanks to my lovely roundtable of authors here. Stay tuned for our next live Q&A in November. We'll have news coming out about that soon. Thanks everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.